I worked for China Radio International, Radio Beijing, back in the 1980s as a journalist advisor. And that was a very illuminating experience to see how they dealt with news. Interestingly, at that time, they didn't really care too much about censoring international news. A lot of what they reported was straight off the what we call the rip and read from Reuters in the news. But it was the Chinese news, the news about what was going on in China, that was very heavily controlled, because they thought, well, who cares about the rest of the world? But we're definitely going to control what the Chinese people know about China. And they were. People don't seem to realize how controlled things are in China. I mean, Xi Jinping, the current premier, he very much sees himself as a sort of reincarnation of Mao Zedong, very expansionist, very controlling. He has set in motion a surveillance system that is unparalleled, I believe, in the world for the citizens, the social credit system. That I'm sure there are folks in other countries would love to institute exactly as they have there. The social credit system is something that the Chinese people cannot opt out of, and you are judged according to your behavior, what you buy, who you consort with, what your views are. Everything that that you do online is recorded. And if your scores aren't high enough, you will find that you cannot get a loan, you don't get a job, you can't be on a train or travel on a plane, or it can infringe your liberty completely if you don't get good enough scores in your social credit system. So China is a lesson for the West to look at, because that's where things can go if certain measures are taken to extremes. And if you look at what they did during COVID, where they had lockdowns and people didn't have enough food to eat, and they were actually throwing themselves out of windows, committing suicide in places like Shanghai because things were so bad. So yeah, I mean, every country has censorship. Some countries just have more censorship than others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really what the agenda is going forward with the CBDC, the central bank digital currency system, seems to be the method to move that social currency system into the West. The only thing really standing in the way of implementing that is, seems to me, the U.S. Constitution and the First and Second Amendments specifically, but it seems like that's the agenda, and they're slowly trying to peel away the layers of the Constitution in order to put into place that model that China has erected. And even people like Klaus Schwab and Noah Harari from the World Economic Forum last week at Davos actually were speaking of that in general, that the model that we should be focusing on turning the entire planet into is that Chinese model.
I certainly was quite happy to be leaving China. I mean, I'm glad I had the experience of working there. There were some wonderful people that I worked with, but the system is such that you have to live in it to really understand what it's like. You can't really understand it until you've lived it, and how much control there is, and how it's taken for granted that control exists. It's mind-blowing. It was Mao Zedong in many ways was able to create an entire police prison state. And a lot of the things that Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded him, did, he was able to roll back quite a lot of those controls. He was actually one of the best things that ever happened to China, and he had all kinds of reforms, including term limits, which was a fantastic thing for China. And guess what? Xi Jinping rolled that back and got rid of term limits. So he's there for life.
Yeah, the CCP agenda is really like, you know, not only specifically taken over all of China, but has spread throughout its agenda to dominate the world like everywhere. You know,
Yeah.
I actually just saw there's a great documentary. If it's a long one, it's 2.5 hours or so. Just was released on Epoch Times, but it's called "The Final War," and it documents the entire Chinese agenda, the CC, you know, and I want to just say, right, you know, it's different. The Chinese people are not the CCP. The CCP is not the Chinese people. Love the Chinese people, but you know, or as Steve Bannon calls them, the Lao Baijing. But you know, we do know that the CCP itself is a brutal and ruthless, patient, you know, cartel that basically has agendas to specifically destroy America, and that's in their, you know, in their spoken plans, and
Yeah. They're very good at soft power, what they call
yeah,
soft power. And to give you just one example that was that I knew about because I worked for China Radio International and Radio Beijing. So they have been expanding the number of languages they broadcast in, the number of countries that Radio Beijing is available in. At the same time, the BBC was restricting and cutting back on the number of languages that the BBC World Service was broadcasting in. So, and that was, in terms of geopolitics, that was a pretty short-sighted move to do, so that the Chinese companies often own very key businesses in the West, and people don't even realize it. They own apparently a substantial amount of Forbes magazine. And once that happened, the journalists that were reporting on the democracy movement in the democracy protests in Hong Kong, and who weren't necessarily writing about China in a positive light, those journalists were either found that they lost their positions, or they had to only produce articles that showed China in a positive light. And that's what happens when they control organs of the press in foreign countries. The main reason why that happens is so that these particular organizations will report on China in a very positive way.
Yes.
And they call it soft power. It's funny because my youngest son spent a year abroad at a university in Beijing, Zhemin Daxue, the People's University of China, one of the top social science universities in Beijing. And there was a wonderful comment that came out by from one of his lecturers, who said, well, the reason why the West criticizes China about their treatment of Tibet is that our propaganda just wasn't good enough. As simple as that. Not good enough propaganda, you know?
Yeah.
There you go.
Wow. Wow.
And the treatment of the people in Tibet and in Xinjiang is absolutely appalling and hardly reported on in the West. There are massive concentration camps, and I'm using that in the concentration camps is often an overused word that, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, but these are genuine concentration camps that Tibetan and Uyghur people from Xinjiang are put into. There is genocide, in effect, going on in those areas in China that is barely reported on. It's very, very serious.
Yeah, we know the story quite often hits the air about the Tibetan people and the way that Tibet was wiped out, and but they're still facing prosecution, and we really don't hear any persecution, but we don't really hear much of that anymore these days.
And Xinjiang, they don't report much. Xinjiang, where the Muslim Uyghur people are, that incredible persecution and imprisonment of people there.
Yeah, there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been millions of Uyghurs that have been either imprisoned or murdered, disappeared over the last decade or so.
Yep.
And it was interesting. It was great to see that over the last couple months, with the really repressive lockdowns that occurred in China, how many people were standing up, and how that power of those riots in the streets, the protests really seemed to actually get the attention of those in charge, and they did roll back those really repressive and tyrannical mandates. But when we were talking about that, it brought back images of Tiananmen Square. It brought back that picture of the fist of the totalitarian Chinese government squashing the little person, and that was something that I think many were scared of. But it seemed like the population uprising was larger than it has ever been through the history of China that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I was, it happened shortly after I left China. And what I heard was that the protesters camped in Tiananmen Square, democracy protesters. A lot of students, a lot of professional people were there. And the government sent in troops from Beijing and from the local area from Beijing, and they refused to fire on the people. They didn't want to do anything. So instead, the government sent in troops from outside Beijing, and this hasn't been reported, but it's what actually happened. And in order for them to make these troops much more aggressive than they would normally be, they told them that there was a lot of disease in the encampments in the square where the protesters were, and they said they had to have vaccinations to protect them from these diseases. And they weren't vaccinations, they were in fact amphetamines. And so they got the troops in there, and they were incredibly trigger happy. And from what I heard from somebody I know who was there, they were even shooting the soda sellers on the corner, on the side of the street, who had nothing to do with the demonstrations. And the reason why they found out that the troops had been shot full of amphetamines was that doctors who were treating troops who were injured in the clashes, and along with all of the many thousands of protesters who were injured and killed, but the troops all showed very high levels of amphetamine in their systems. So that was the story that I heard, and I believe it's true that was how they managed to get the troops to react very aggressively against the protesters in Tiananmen Square. That started, it was June the 3rd, 1989. The evening of June the 3rd was when they started, when that protest happened. And what was remarkable was that Radio Beijing, the government organization, which had maybe 10 minutes of live broadcasting a day, very little was live, it was mostly pre-recorded. Well, the people who were doing that broadcast heard that a couple of their comrades from Radio Beijing were killed by troops in that demonstration. They were furious, and they actually broadcast on air for just under 2 minutes about what happened.
And that's the clip that you sent me, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, that's what do you say we take a listen to it?
Yeah, it's a little piece of history, and it shows that even people who are in government-controlled organizations who knew they were going to be detained afterwards will speak the truth.
All right. Well, let's we have some audio here, and let's listen to this broadcast. It's about 2 minutes long, you said?
Yeah, just under 2 minutes.
Excellent.
It's that little...
中国国际广播电台.
This is Radio Beijing.
This is Radio Beijing. Please remember June the 3rd, 1989. The most tragic event happened in the Chinese capital, Beijing. Thousands of people, most of them innocent civilians, were killed by fully armed soldiers when they forced their way into the city. Among the killed are our colleagues at Radio Beijing. The soldiers were riding on armored vehicles and used machine guns against thousands of local residents and students who tried to block their way. When the army convoys made a breakthrough, soldiers continued to spray their bullets indiscriminately at crowds in the street. Eyewitnesses say some armored vehicles even crossed foot soldiers who hesitated in front of the resisting civilians. Radio Beijing English Department deeply mourns those died in the tragic incident and appeals to all its listeners to join our protest for the gross violation of human rights and the most barbarous suppression of the people. Because of the abnormal situation here in Beijing, there is no other news we could bring you. We sincerely ask for your understanding and thank you for joining us at this most tragic moment.
Wow.
It was unbelievable that they actually did that. And I did hear that although the announcer was detained, that I think eventually everybody involved with that broadcast ended up escaping to the United States. That's what I heard.
Wow. Well, it's great that they got out. I bet you that doesn't. Not everyone gets out from the Chinese party and
My God!
after doing something like that.
Normally, they'd probably find themselves under a death sentence. I mean, that was more the common way of dealing with things. And what I heard was that one of the reasons why the Tiananmen protest got so as far as it did was that there was a power struggle going on in the Politburo, which distracted them from reacting speedily to that demonstration. Because normally what they would do is if there were protests, the foreign press would never hear about it. But there was I think Gorbachev was in town at the time. And so tons of foreign journalists were in Beijing during the time of that protest. But normally what would happen is that there would be a protest. The authorities would photograph everybody. They would wait for the people to go home to their various homes, and then they would arrest them and throw them all in jail, and a lot of them would disappear. That was their standard operating technique in terms of dealing with protests. But the trouble was that they had a bit of a power struggle. The protest was happening also when there was a public event with a lot of foreigners involved. So that was why it became something that the foreign news heard about and covered. A lot of foreign journalists were actually injured, roughed up and injured by the troops as well at the time.
Wow. What an event for getting an echo again here.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, wow. What a great wild time in history with them people actually having the courage to stand up against such a authoritarian tyrannical government. Do you see parallels with the current uprising that just happened, the most recent uprising? With the people, with the way that it was a people-driven movement, and it seemed like to be much more widespread than just in Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of it, we didn't get as much news out as we would like because so much of it is controlled. But it was heartening that actually something was done. But this time it was so incredibly egregious because they were basically incarcerating these people in their homes when some of them weren't even sick. And if they were sick, it was not a very virulent form because Omicron was much less virulent than the earlier forms of COVID. And the people that were being locked up, they didn't have access to food. They weren't allowed to leave their homes. In some cases, they were boarding up the doors of people's homes in these apartment buildings to prevent them from getting out there. And so it was egregious. It was seriously egregious, more so than a lot of what they've done before. And I think that if you push people far enough, they will finally rebel. There's so many. There is that frog in the water syndrome when you do things slowly and gently, and people don't. And they suddenly realize that they're in a prison, and they didn't realize at the beginning. But this was so damn obvious that you couldn't, and it was so quick that they would just have these quarantines and these whole apartment buildings, and millions of people would be in effect incarcerated. And that was, people knew about it. Everybody has mobile phones. They were passing on information to their relatives and friends. So this was known throughout China, what was going on, somewhat. So that's why there was the reaction that we saw, and it got to be on such a scale that the government had to react. They couldn't ignore it. And what they most likely did, and I vaguely remember reading about it, is they like to blame somebody else. So they blamed the local authority or whatever for reacting incorrectly. So the central government, when they don't like the results, they'll blame the local government, and they'll have somebody as a fall guy, so they can say, well, it wasn't us, the central government, it was because these local officials didn't react correctly.
Yeah.
Standard thing. I mean, and one of Xi Jinping's standard tools, whenever he comes across anybody that he doesn't like or anything that he doesn't like, he has his campaign against corruption, and so he can say that this particular official whose actions he didn't like was corrupt, and that's a good reason to be able to arrest them and make them disappear.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems that it seems to me, there's been a lot of talk about the economy of China starting to really start to crash with things like Evergrande, being collapsing, and there was a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity and speculations whether realistically these lockdowns weren't necessarily about a virus, but it was about preventing a run on the banks and a collapse of their overall economic and banking structure. Because I know a lot of banks were frozen where you couldn't take money out, and they really had the opening of the door to shift to a CBDC, the central bank. And now I believe they just rolled out the digital yuan, right? I think that's what it's called.
I don't know a lot about that particular issue, but it was one of the problems was that even trying to order stuff online, these people were unable to get what they needed. Nobody was delivering, and nobody was able to get anything. And I mean, when you deny people food and you deny them the ability to leave their homes, you do get a pushback. And whether or not it was a smokescreen for the collapse of the banking system or the collapse of the economy, I don't know. I can't really speak for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was speculation that a lot of people had, some economists that I've been listening to, and I just wonder, what that's going to look like going forward, and as we spread out into the rest of the planet, because the ripple effects obviously will occur, right, with an economy as large as China. It's going to be interesting to watch going forward.
Yeah, well, we needed a lot of. I mean, there were so many Chinese products that were being imported into the US, and so many raw materials that were coming in from China, rare earth materials and stuff like that. So they do play a key role in the world economy. So if that economy is destabilized, then it will obviously have a ripple effect for the rest of the world.
Yeah, truly.